What's up, everybody? Peter X. the Coffer here, and welcome to the 5 things I love about Pink Floyd. It says like, but all these 5 things I like, I really love, but you can't, you know how it is, But yeah, I love me some Pink Floyd. Before we jump in, I mean, my little Pink Floyd journey. I often talk about that batch of 20 to 25 albums that my aunt gave me when I was in middle school in the late 70s. It was either 78 or 79, and Dark Side of the Moon was one of those albums. And that was also when The Wall was out. So, my middle school years. I mean, The Wall was massive. I mean, the year it was out, that's all, everywhere you went, everybody was playing The Wall. It was a huge, I'm pretty sure it's Diamond, but The Wall was, so that was, that was my initial foray and introduction to Pink Floyd. But interestingly enough, I'd heard some of their own other songs throughout the years on classic radio, but it wasn't until the streaming era until I, branched out and got more, uh, exposure to their catalog. And it was, when I was making my third album, 2020, Cyberpunk 2020. That's kind of really when I was like, man, there's a lot of Pink Floyd in this music I'm doing, even though it's been years since I've listened to it and whatnot. So yeah, my Cyberpunk 2020 albums is kind of a weird mismatch of influences. You got Pink Floyd, you got early funkadelic. I'm talking about the rock side of funkadelic, mixed in there with Public Enemy. I mean, those are the three big main ingredients. A little bit of Hendrix in there as well. But anyway, so that's my first. This is my little history of falling in love with Pink Floyd, so to speak. And when I was going back to that first batch of records, even though as a 13-year-old, brain damage kind of freaked me out and the laughing and shit. Still came back to that album, and at some point I'm going to do a classic album session episode on Dark Side of the Moon, because it is a classic. So let's get started in those 5 things. Thing number one, I love the early years from Pink Floyd. I mean, they weren't all that commercially viable. It's pretty psychedelic, even though, the first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn is considered a psychedelic classic. And, after that, this is when they started with Sid Barrett, and then he had his mental health issues, and then they bring in David Gilmour. I think it's the second album when this happens. So yeah, I mean, that's a good album, but they're pretty psychedelic, and they even, it's very guitar, centric, and some of these albums don't even have a whole lot of lyrics to them, the Umagama and metal and that kind of stuff. But I particularly love, they've released a lot of concerts from that 68, 69, 70 era, and where there is just David Gilmour just doing David Gilmour stuff, and love that. So I do love the early stuff. So that's number one. I love the early stuff that doesn't get a lot of acclaim, and I think those albums, there's both of Roger, the album Roger Waters hates and the album David Gilmour hates are part of those, this early stuff. But I like it. Thing number two, as songwriters, they were not afraid to break the rules. First of all, they had a pretty, no romance rule when it came to writing. I mean, um, Young Lust, ooh, I had a dirty woman, I need a dirty gal. I mean, from The Wall. So there's sex, but that's probably the closest thing you're going to get to romance or sex with Pink Floyd. But it worked for them. Um, the other thing I loved about them is, they were, we're going to go on this musical journey and however long it takes, it takes. So they did long songs. Hey, I like to do some long songs too. So I'm rolling with these dudes because of that. So you got a Shine On, You Crazy Diamond. That was the album after Dark Side of the Moon. I think it was Wish You Were Here. So they have two versions of this. They had a part one and a part two, Shine On You Crazy Diamond. So it's about Sid Barrett, 1333 and 1224. I mean, that's what this is clocking in at. Then on the Animals album, you got Dogs at 17 minutes and 4 seconds, Pigs at 11 minutes and 28 seconds, and Sheep at 10 minutes and 20 seconds. So hey, screw the rules. It works. I love, sometimes if you want a short story, you want a novella, heck, in some of these you can call them novels, musical novels. And I love the fact that Pink Floyd was just like, hey, we're doing us. We're gonna, do what it takes to do, to accomplish the mission with this song, and they go ahead and do it. Number 3, David Gilmour and Richard Wright. Ooh, where did I kind of touched on this. I think, on one of my 3 things of the month, I did uh, a Roger Waters just redid, his newest retake on Dark Side of the Moon. And I think that's where I talk about David Gilmour and Richard Wright. And so David Gilmour, great guitarist. Maybe he was the top most important guitarist of classic rock. But anyway, got to touch on this here because it's what I love about him. David Gilmour is a great guitarist. I talk about, you got Hendrix here, you got Jimi Hendrix over here, you got in the middle, you got Eric Clapton, and then right over here, you got David Gilmour. I call David Gilmour the emotive, emotional guitar, a mellower blues, and then you got Hendrix shredding, you got Clapton doing both of them. Then over here, later, you got Eddie Van Halen shredding. So, but, Richard Wright was a great keyboard player, used synthesizers wonderfully, throughout the 70s, and just how David Gilmour and Richard Wright, how they interacted, and, the discussions, the conversations between the keyboard and the guitar and Pink Floyd stuff is just amazing. So that is, that's number 3 of the 5 things I love about Pink Floyd. Number 4, the concept album. This is what Pink Floyd is famous for. They were probably the best to ever do this, certainly in the classic rock vein. A lot of other people have tried it in different genres. And they've certainly had the most, commercial success doing this. But, Dark Side of the Moon, the many things that happen in life. I mean, if you haven't listened, the 70s, I was a kid, is a pretty interesting decade. I think I've mentioned in some of the episodes when it comes to the 2020s, which we're in. I mean, it's kind of like, I read about the late, the 60s, and when things are jumping off right now, it's the 60s, but when things are quiet, it's the 70s, because even when it's quiet right now, here we are sitting in 2024, shit's weird. And the 70s was kind of weird. So if you had to have been there, but if you want to listen to a great soundtrack of the 70s to get kind of how weird the 70s is, Dark Side of the Moon is that. I remember when VH1 Behind the Music and the albums, they just said it's one of the best slice of life albums ever. And it really is. I mean, when I think I've said this in other episodes, but when you talk about, you want to understand the 70s for white folks, it's Pink Floyd, and for black folks, it's George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic. They kind of tap into the weirdness of the 70s and, in their own ways that these communities had. Next, you have the Pink Floyd, The Wall, and this comes about because Roger Waters didn't think that fans were paying attention as much as they should have in their concerts, and he got alienated, with the concert goers. So when they did do the wall tour, he actually built a wall on the stage and then tore it down. So yeah, the concept, this is the alienation that Roger Waters has between himself and the audience, and for these concept albums, I mean, Roger Waters, we're going to talk about this in number 5, but, Roger Waters is, he kind of built or came up with these concepts, the main lyricist here. Wish You Here, this is alienation and critique of the music business. Wish You Here is the album that followed, Dark Side of the Moon. Then Animals is followed Wish You Were Here, and it's loosely based on George Orwell's book The Animals, and so and the song names are of animals. So love the fact that Pink Floyd did these concept albums and ran with them all full tilt. So that's number 4, Pink Floyd and their concept albums. Number 5, this rift between David Gilmour and Roger Waters. For a while there, you could get into, these equivalents on Facebook of the chat rooms, and if you were, a fan page or whatever, a group page for Pink Floyd, and inevitably, someone's like, who is more important, David Gilmour or Roger Waters? I sort of, take it down the middle because I think the sound was certainly David Gilmour. Because in case the Final Cut was the last album in the early 80s. In 1987, the lawyers got together and there was a settlement. Originally Roger Waters didn't want them doing, touring and doing albums with the name Pink Floyd. So that got settled. So albums following Roger Waters, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, 1987, The Division Bell, 1994, and The Endless River, 2014. I like the 3, post Roger Waters albums. Where I fall on this split is I appreciate the concepts and the cerebral nature that Roger Waters brought. But David Gilmour, the sound, that classic Pink Floyd sound, a Pink Floyd song when you hear it. I mean, and that was David Gilmour, because when Roger Waters left, that the trademark, the brand sound of Pink Floyd stayed, and Roger Waters was not able to recreate the brand, the sound of the brand of Pink Floyd. Now he he did it pretty good, I think, with his Dark Side of the Moon redo. There's elements of the Pink Floyd sound there, but but without the guitar, you can't. I mean, come on, Pink Floyd would know. David Gilmour, come on. But going back to number 3, it was their sound is David Gilmour, weaved in with Richard Wright's keyboards. So I appreciate what Roger Waters brings, but I also, and a lot of Pink Floyd fans disagree because a lot of Pink Floyd fans don't like the post-Roger Waters Pink Floyd, but I do. So, and that is, whether you like it or not, that is that quintessential Pink Floyd sound is still there in those last three. Now, the cerebral, maybe not as much. But, they were at a different place in their life, and, I'm in my 50s, and they were in their 50s when they did, those last three albums, and I still, it still speaks to me. So, but, the other thing is I do think, lately Roger Waters has kind of stepped on his own message. I mean, he's been a supporter of the Palestinian situation in Gaza for years, and I am too, but you have to balance it. He has been criticized as the charges of anti-Semitism have been lobbed against him. Now, it's not as cut and dried as certainly with Ye, but it's still out there. And the other thing is, for some reason, Roger Waters is supporting Russia and this, the invasion of the Ukraine, which I don't get. And that kind of, to me, that steps on all of the, all the concept albums he did, because, I mean, Russia went in there with no provocation whatsoever. It had no business, invading Ukraine and doing what they did. So he thinks they do. And the other thing you have to take into consideration is Roger Waters has a huge ego. I forget what year it was, but he went into Toronto. This is either right before lockdown and the pandemic or right after, and he got mad because he was in Toronto and none of the local media music folks, newspaper, radio would nobody showed up, and they were like, well, dude, literally that weekend, I can't remember, I think it was between the two of them, Drake and The Weeknd, one of them had dropped a new album, the other had kicked off their latest concert tour. So that's what they were covering. And I'm like, okay, look here. Like it or not, Drake is the biggest, artist, in streams, period. I mean, he is the most streamed artist in the streaming era. So he, take your pick, the Beatles, Elvis, Michael Jackson. Drake is that dude, whether you like it or not. Now, eventually Taylor Swift's had something to say about that, but that's just a reality. And classic rock is not the genre, doesn't have the clout it used to. And I'm just kind of like, dude. And then, I mean, the most streamed song in the history of music is, put out there by The Weeknd and Blinding Lights. So these are two huge artists. Get over yourself. And so that's part of it. I mean, right now, David Gilmour and Roger Waters can't stand each other. That's never going to get, healed. And they're, so we're not, I think most Pink Floyd fans know that there's never going to be a reunion. They just sold the catalog for, I believe, roughly $400 million. So, hey, they did okay and whatnot. So, yeah, so that's where I stand on Pink Floyd. I've been waiting to do this for a while. Number 5, David Gilmour and Roger Waters. There's a rivalry. Where's that happened before? I mean, come on. I mean, things were always, the last few years with the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, there was a lot of friction there. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards don't always see eye to eye. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith don't always see eye to eye. This is nothing new, and sometimes the friction create something brilliant. And I think, when it's, when we think about Pink Floyd, that's what happened. So number 5, the David Gilmour, Roger Waters rivalry. So yeah, let me hit this close. So subscribe to the channel, leave some comments, hit the like button. Got 5 albums of my own. Uh, they're locked up here on the channel here under Peter X's Okafor. All 5 of my albums are also on all the major streaming services, and I record under the name Exodus, Xodus. My first album is called Book One. I'm also a science fiction fantasy author, and I have 2 novels and a novella on Amazon, and I write under the name Peter Exodus Okafor. So thank you for coming through, and I will see you next episode.